Hmm.
Oh, it's going. I'm just running out of time. I've got, yeah, it's going. Okay.
Hmm.
That sounds great. Okay. Tomorrow, Thursday, I've got to kind of do a Groundhog Day reminder because I need like, 50 seconds ish. If I'm not good at that, it's scenic. Right. Okay. So the actual celebration is on Sunday the first, Saturday the first, and then the Groundhog Day is on Sunday. But I think the actual celebration is on Saturday. And I tried to put in the details, but maybe if you can double check, I think their schedule is online. They've got a website or Facebook schedule. That'd be great. Anything else? I don't know what the extension segment is yet for Thursday.
The live stream's acting up a little bit, so bear with me.
Thank you.
No problem.
Which one? BookTube or?
I think it should show up maybe now that I'll have, because I hate that this is misleading. Good afternoon from the 1011 Now streaming studio. I'm Danielle Shenk. This is Inside the Story with the Flatwater Free Press, a nonprofit news organization in Nebraska that focuses on investigative and feature stories. Today, we're sitting down with Natalia Alamdari, a reporter there at FFP, to discuss her series, Nebraska Evolving. Now, Natalia, it's been a little while since we've talked about this series. Can you kind of catch us up a little bit? I think we had started with Wakefield, and it's been a while.
Yes, and there have been a lot of stories in between now and then. Sorry, it looked like my camera glitched for a second, so I hope you can still see me.
Yes.
Um, Yeah, so we started off this story with a visit to, or we started off this series with a visit to Wakefield, kind of laying that groundwork of, what immigration has looked like in Nebraska, how it's shaped communities, helped certain communities grow throughout the state. And since that point, we published a series of five other stories, I
Oh,
believe, off the top of my head, kind of exploring different communities throughout Nebraska, whether it was looking at, who helps supply quinceañera dresses for girls turning 15 in different communities. What nonprofit has emerged in South Sioux City to help the growing Somali population? And one of those stories that is still very near and dear to my heart, following a student in Schuyler through his day, not only going to class, but working 11 hours overnight on top of
wow.
that. So that's kind of been the trajectory of the series. And then this past week, we're continuing on with it, given, just the political climate and what has been talked about from the president's office about immigration and mass deportations. We're kind of keeping tabs on, how our advocates and attorneys preparing for what President Trump is calling I'm blanking on the exact quote, but the
Yeah.
largest deportation operation he hopes to take on in American history. So we really looked at, how are people preparing? What are people thinking in terms of safety planning? And a big part of that tied to schools, since the schools in Grand Island and O'Neill during both of the large scale raids that Nebraska's seen in the past 20 years, kind of were on the forefront of, okay, we have students who don't have parents to pick them up after school. What do we do? So for a lot of folks, it's been, looking back at how things have gone and what lessons they can carry on over the next 4 years just to be prepared for whatever happens. Because that's the thing is we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And like you said, touching on a kind of a hot topic here with this latest article about Trump's mass deportations, how many Nebraskans might this impact? And in your view, how are Nebraska communities feeling about this?
Sure. So the number is a little shaky because it just depends on what subcategories of immigrants and different kinds of visas end up getting affected. But the broad scope of it, and I wish I had the exact numbers in front of me, but overall there are about 150,000 foreign-born immigrants living in Nebraska, and that's a mix of people who have citizenship, different types of visas allowing them to work and live in the state, and also folks who are undocumented. The estimated number of undocumented residents in Nebraska is about 40,000. That's according to a Pew Research Center study released in the past, I think 2 years it was. Um, and that number is likely an undercount just because it's a hard community to survey and get with census numbers and things like that. So the estimated number is at about 40,000. Within that 150,000 number too, there are also folks who are on temporary protected status. That's a temporary program that allows you to live and work in the US if it's dangerous to go back to your home country. And I believe about 2,000 people on that program in Nebraska, maybe 1,800. Similar number, 2,600 people on DACA, so
Hmm.
Dreamers, kids who are brought to the country with their parents and don't really have a path to permanent residency. DACA is kind of the temporary fix for that. And so those are just categories that, Trump has talked about in the past. During his first presidency, tried to make changes to those programs. Things got held up in court. So it's just kind of a matter of seeing what happens this time around and whether or not those two categories will be pinpointed within the administration. There's also different categories like asylum, refugee seekers, which I don't have exact numbers on those, but those are
Hmm.
definitely groups of people in Nebraska who are probably paying attention to things right now. Um, the second half of your question, was it how people are preparing? Am I remembering that right?
How the communities are feeling about this for the few that you've talked to.
Sure, sure. I think it's a mix just from what I've heard in the past 2 weeks or so of checking in with people. There are groups of people who are like, it'll be fine. Like, we don't have anything to worry about. This isn't going to impact us in whatever community you're looking at. Um, but then there are also people who are more scared, just like a mix of fear, paranoia, worry of like, what happens if I go to work and I'm detained and separated from my kid, just that kind of concern of like not really knowing um, exactly how cautious to be. I think it's just really the uncertainty of everything that's got um, people a little bit on edge, but you definitely see a mix of feelings and responses across the state.
And so, I guess, can you kind of talk about some of the gray area, as you were mentioning before, that there are quite a few different, I guess, I don't know if types of immigrants is the right word, but like, yeah, that it's not so black and white when it comes to either you're an immigrant or you're not.
Yeah, and I am not an attorney, so I will probably muddle my way through some of this because I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Um, but I think there is an attorney who said this in the story, it's a lot more complicated than documented versus undocumented. There's a lot of gray area. For example, there are a lot of teenagers and kids who they enter the country, they cross the border illegally, but then they declare asylum or ask for asylum status, basically saying, there's not a safe place for me to go to in my home country. A lot of times they're placed with either a relative or a sponsor in the US who can be their guardian for that period of time. Um, and once they get to that point, there's a lot of different processes they can go through. I'm blanking on the letters. Special juvenile immigrant status is a process that kids can go through that can eventually lead to something more permanent. And that's one thing where the question is, okay, if you have a teenager who's in that process, is the immigration court going to still try and go through a removal process, even if that special juvenile immigrant status case is still ongoing. So there's a lot of gray areas there. There's also U visas if you're a victim of a crime and you're um, talking with the police
Hmm.
trying to help solve the crime. That's a category of folks who could be affected. Temporary protected status is one that I mentioned. And then there's just a whole list of different um, work visas, refugee status, asylum seekers. Like there are so many different um, categories that a person can fall into to the point where when I was working on that story in Skylar about the student who moved here from Guatemala, he um, was trying to explain to me like what his situation is, and it's so confusing that he was even having a hard time describing like what point in the process he's at.
Wow. And so, with all of this kind of confusion and things like that, what have officials and community leaders kind of been doing to potentially prepare for these deportations if they do happen?
Sure. I feel like this is something that people are still figuring out and talking about. Like I know in Omaha, I haven't I think there's a press conference like literally and what the police department plans on doing. I think what they had said was like they're not going to be questioning people about their immigration status like during traffic stops or if you're reporting a crime or
Hmm.
anything like that. Um, I know communities are really, I know a lot more from the school's perspective and thinking through, um, safety planning, making sure that parents know like ways that they can be prepared. Or there's a lot of talk of, make sure that you have someone assigned to be a temporary guardian if you and your child are separated. Documentation your children should have if, say, you're deported and you want your kids to come with you if they're American citizens, like the documents and paperwork that you should have filled out ahead of time. So it's really a lot of um, just like educating is the main focus right now from all the different groups I've talked to. I know schools are really focused on, what is our responsibility
Hmm.
under the law? Like advocating for students' rights, advocating for parents' rights, all things like that. So yeah, I think everyone's kind of caught in this balance of like, okay, we want to be prepared, but we don't want to be fear mongering, but we also don't want to be unprepared. So there's just like it's just really tough to navigate for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah. And so ICE has kind of long avoided some of these sensitive places like churches, schools, and hospitals and things like that. But the Trump administration is considering reversing that policy. And so, I mean, are there even legal steps that these groups can take, or kind of what's the thought process there?
Um, that is something that I don't know the answer to. And whether or not Trump reverses the policy of ICE entering schools and churches, like I think that's still a little up in the air. I know that that had come from, there was an NBC report a couple weeks ago signaling that that was the intention of the administration. I haven't heard anything official yet. Um, if that were to be reversed, I think the typical advice given to like schools and churches is still like, does if an ICE officer comes to your building, like make sure that they have a valid warrant or a valid subpoena signed, like just going through those like verification steps. Um, and I guess like something to mention too is just like there's so much that is being said and so much like up in the
Mm-hmm.
airness to it all. Even today, like there were reports that there would be ICE agents in Chicago, and now it's Tuesday and that hasn't happened, but it still has like just the chilling effect through the community of people maybe not showing up to work that day or being scared to go to the grocery store. It's just a lot of, navigating what's said and what's planned versus what actually ends up getting signed into executive orders or policy and things like that. So everyone's very much in a wait and see kind of situation.
Mm-hmm. And did you touch on in your article at all, I guess, kind of going into the court system and how this might, impact an immigration court?
Yeah, I mean, the Omaha Immigration Court is already extremely backlogged to the point where, um, say you're waiting for an asylum hearing, you might be waiting 3 or 4 years for that to even happen. And the way one attorney described it to me is that if deportations on the scale that the president has talked about actually end up happening, you could be looking at like 10-year wait periods within that court just because that's how backlogged it already is.
Wow. And then I guess another aspect of this is Governor Jim Pillen and his supporters. What are some of the things that they've been saying or about this?
Sure. The governor has already stated support for whatever the president decides to take on. He and other Republican governors all signed on to a letter saying, whatever resources we as states need to contribute, we will, whether it's contributing state law enforcement or the National Guard. What that ends up looking like in practice, we'll see. Um, but yeah, it's just we'll see what ends up happening. That's the extent of what I've seen from the governor's office on this
Hmm.
front.
And so you also talked with the ACLU attorney Dylan Severino. He's been quite involved in your article. What kind of advice did he have for families? And I mean, what happens if a child's parent gets taken away?
Like I said before, a lot of it is just making sure that you have your documents in order, your kids know, having phone numbers memorized, having a family member, friend already assigned to be the one to pick up your kids and make like keep them taken care of. One attorney described it to me as like a shift from instead it's not necessarily immigration law that people are having to think through right now. It's more like estate planning, um, and just making sure, everything's signed that needs to be signed and copies are in the right place. And um, yeah, one other thing, like from the student perspective that he had said was, make sure students know what their rights are if they interact with ICE, remember badge numbers, remember names, remember the right to an attorney, and all sorts of things like that. So the focus really is on education, having attorneys lined up to show up in case a crisis happens, like volunteer attorneys, and yeah, just making sure people know what their rights are in different situations.
Right. And I mean, we've touched a little on schools. How would these raids potentially impact hospitals and churches as well?
Yeah, that goes back to whether or not ICE decides to reverse its typical policy of not going into those spaces. Um, I think it's something that people are still like in a wait and see kind of phase, because the thought process has been like you don't want someone to not seek care if they need it, for fear of ICE being in a space like that. Um, but yeah, I know that Sierra and the ACLU had both mentioned, okay, we did this training for teachers and educators, and there's potential plans to do the same for healthcare so that they can know like what the legal rights are in a situation like that.
Right. And so, what's some of the biggest takeaways that you've had from doing this article and this series?
Um, let me think. I mean, with this article, just the complicated nature of everything tied to immigration, whether it's the different categories of visas and temporary statuses and documents that people need and who's able to work, who's not able to work. And it's just very tangled and a lot more complicated than people realize. Um, with the series itself, I mean, I'm not from Nebraska, so for me, it's just been really interesting to um, spend time in so many different communities across the state, and to also just experience the different cultures that are within Nebraska. I feel like there's always an assumption about, not that I would call us this, but, flyover country and the
Hmm.
Midwest and lack of diversity, but like there are like very diverse communities all across the state. Like I hung out in the quinceañera store for a couple hours and that was really fun. I got to try Somali food in South Sioux, and just like meeting so many different people across the state and hearing their stories was just, I mean, why I'm in the job. So something I hope to continue doing in the next, with whatever other stories come.
Hmm. And so, as we kind of wrap up here, can you kind of touch on the sort of divide this situation has created? I mean, there are some that are fearful, and there are some that think nothing will even happen.
Sure, like there's divide in that sense of, how prepared should we be? There's divide in the sense of, folks who are supportive of deportations and thinking that whatever the president is proposing is the right thing to do. You've got um people in the business community who are like, we need immigrants in order to like fully staff our meatpacking plants and manufacturing, and so just that balance of like the necessity of a group of people versus the policies that people are talking about. I do think that in Nebraska, it's really interesting that you have this very like cross industry, cross advocacy coming together to call for more friendly immigration policies, a clearer path to permanent residency for people. Um, so it's just a lot of different factors at place. And yeah, it'll just be something that we at Flatwater are going to continue to follow and cover over the coming months, years, whatever the
Hmm.
time frame may be.
Alrighty. And so, is there anything that you want to add about this series or this article here today?
Just that, like I said, this is something that we're sticking with. So whether it's, interesting feature stories or accountability stories, business stories, we are keeping tabs. I know I've been having conversations with people throughout the state over the past few weeks, months, and hope to continue to do so. If you want us to visit your town, like reach out. I love driving around and talking to people. So, just, if anyone ever has any ideas of stories or things impacting their community, like that's our bread and butter, just
Yeah.
talking to folks and going to the place.
Yeah, and if you are a viewer and you're not sure how to get in touch with Natalia, you can always get in touch with myself here at 1011, and we'll pass the word on, because this is such a great series, and as you've said, it really highlights just how diverse Nebraska really is, and that some people just haven't realized that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, thanks so much for joining us here, Natalia.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Natalia's article, Coming Crackdown, Nebraska Schools, Churches, Immigrants Brace for Trump Promised Historic Deportation, is available on 1011now.com or flatwaterfreepress.org. For more news and updates, you can visit our website and follow us on all our social platforms. From our newsroom to wherever you are, see you on the next stream.